So we'll move on to some questions for all the four speakers. We have quite a few questions. We will not be able to answer all of them. We'll try to answer them for about 10 minutes. The rest of the questions we'll try to answer on our website. We will try to put them on. Okay. So let's start with a question to Uma. So here's a question from SMS, which says, is sex ratio also reason for extinction in tigers? Is this, somehow can this be borne out in studies? Is this a problem for humans?
Yeah. So from an evolutionary perspective, we'd always expect sex ratios to be close to 1. Because if, say, there were more males, then females, it would be better to have a female offspring because there's fewer females and the chances of those females having offspring is higher than because they're preferred. So over time, you would always end up having a 1:1 sex ratio. Now, after birth, there can be modifications to the sex ratio because maybe more males can die, for example, or something like that. That happens in a lot of species where there's male-male competition. Species where males fight with each other, like say, potentially tigers. There is a slight bias in the sex ratio we see from camera trap data. If we look at camera trap data on tigers, there's a slight female bias sex ratio. That's also because male tigers disperse. They leave home, whereas daughters tend to stay in territories of their mothers, right? So, but I don't think that this could lead to extinction because in some sense, males are a little bit dispensable. And it's important, I mean, as long as the sex ratio is female biased versus male biased, it shouldn't lead to extinction.
Okay. All right. So here's another question from SMS. Does a domesticated dog have a different genetic makeup as compared to a wild dog? If a wild dog were domesticated, will its genome change over time?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So domesticated dogs originated from wolves. So they are not, so for example, we have wild dogs in India, and that's a different genus, that's Kuon, and it's not the same genus even, it's not very closely related to to domestic dogs, which have kind of originated from wolves. Domestication is a very interesting question genetically. People have tried to study, they've tried to domesticate things. There's a very interesting experiment with foxes in Russia. And they found that certain traits, irrespective of the species, certain traits seem to increase with domestication. One of them is less aggression, lowered aggression seems to increase. So I guess if you were to domesticate a wolf to a dog again, you might see some similar traits. After that, humans have selected for particular traits, like big dogs, or small dogs, or hairy dogs, or something like that.
So does this also percolate down to the genetic makeup?
Yes. So in fact, big dogs have been selected by different groups of humans, but when you look at their genomes, it's the same gene which has increased in all of the big dogs. So though they've been selected by different people, genetically, why a dog is big is the same.
Okay, here's another question from Ram on Twitter. He asks, to increase the population of tigers, could we try a breeding program with artificial insemination?
I hope we won't have to get to that. I don't know, I'm personally quite hopeful. I feel like if we can kind of manage the habitat and maintain connectivity, maybe we can. But there was another person who asked this question, and actually it's a good time for me to say it. It turns out there's something like 7,000 tigers in captivity on farms in Texas, in very, very bad farms in China, etc. So there's many, many more tigers in captivity than in the wild. And this is in a sense a resource which we're kind of ignoring. We're talking about tiger conservation today. We might have to delve into that bank, that genetic bank, and think about things like artificial insemination, but hopefully not yet.
Okay, maybe one last question. You suggested some measures to increase the geographical range of tigers to combat extinction. Can you also suggest measures to tackle behavioral problems like loss of libido or for tigers? Yes. Are there also behavioral issues that contribute to extinction?
I won't talk about libido in tigers because I don't know anything about it. But for example, one of the things which we are going to face a lot of is conflict, right? many of you who've been reading newspapers, in the Western Ghats, there's been quite a lot of conflict relatively recently with tigers also. And we don't know why this is. We may, some scientists think these are, young individuals who are dispersing and they are conflicting. It could also be that there may be certain behavioral types which might be more prone to conflict. I'm trying to qualify that statement because we don't really know whether it's true. But we do know there's personality, right? Individuals have personality. Like even fish have personality, risk-taking personalities versus non-risk-taking personalities. So yeah, there may be, but we're very, very far from that kind of knowledge, especially in terms of linking genetics and behavior.
Thank you, thank you. So let's move on to some questions to Amri. So Amritanshu Prasad, we call him Amri. So here's a question from Rajashri on Twitter. Why are prime numbers so important in cryptography?
The reason prime numbers are important in cryptography is here in cryptography we're using the multiplicative structure. We're multiplying things. And so take the example of the number 6. If you take 2 and 3, they're both less than 6. When you multiply them, you get 6. In a 6-hour clock arithmetic, this is 0. Okay, but if you take a prime number, like 7, then no matter what two numbers you take, as long as they're different from 7, when you multiply them, you still get something different from 7. So this is just like multiplication of rational numbers. When you multiply two rational numbers which are non-zero, you still get a non-zero number. And this gives a certain, so this gives us, a consequence of this fact is that you can also divide. So when your clock is of a prime size, then it is possible to divide. And this is what makes prime numbers so special.
Yes, thank you. So there's another question from SMS, which says, with the advent of quantum cryptography, you spoke about how the current algorithms we have may become outdated or may not become useful. Will there also be new cryptographic algorithms that will come about because of quantum cryptography, quantum computations?
Yeah, certainly there are already people exploring new algorithms for cryptography. I mean, human ingenuity is great, and there are already some candidates. People are looking at polarized light, for example, and I'm sure new systems will come in.
Another question from the SMS participants. Do magic squares have any applications in cryptography?
Well, I don't know really.
Do they have applications
so there
in
are
anything?
some crypto systems like the AES. It kind of takes your data like which you can think of as your roti dough, and it chops it up into pieces and mixes them together. It does so by dividing it into squares, but I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about.
Okay, well, let's take one last question from Hemachandran on Facebook, Hemachandar on Facebook. He asks, why can we not legalize cryptocurrencies and start using blockchain protocol? But perhaps you can answer this in a broader context.
This is a great question. I mean, in some sense, we have no choice in the matter. You cannot illegalize cryptocurrencies because you have absolutely no control over them.
Maybe you can also tell us what cryptocurrencies are.
So let me explain what cryptocurrencies. So many of you may have heard about Bitcoin. So this is an example of a cryptocurrency. Now what's the difference between a cryptocurrency and an ordinary currency? So if I want to pay Uma 10 rupees electronically, then I have to go through a bank. I have to go to my bank account, or I have to go through a credit card, or I have to go to Paytm. There's always an intermediary. Now, the nice thing about governments don't like it. The thing about Bitcoin is that there is no intermediary. It's a distributed system of verification, and nobody can control it. So I can pay her without any third party getting involved. No government can manipulate it. But this is also a huge problem because the Bitcoin is used by criminal networks to do transactions which nobody can trace or keep track of.
So you cannot demonetize Bitcoin.
So it cannot be demonetized. That's a great point. It cannot be demonetized. Some people see this as a big plus. Governments generally tend to be uncomfortable with this idea. But you cannot, there's no point in illegalizing something you cannot regulate.
Okay, thank you, Amri. Let's ask a few questions before we run out of time quickly to Yashwant. So here's a question from Siddharth on Twitter. He asks, can you give us an overview of the LIGO observatory and how it can use radio observations? Or
how it can use radio?
Yes, can radio observations be used for gravitational wave detection?
Okay, all right, I see the connection. So first is that the LIGO or the LIGO is a thing I didn't talk about because I was concentrating on electromagnetic radiation, but it is known since the time Einstein did his work that you can get what is called gravitational radiation. So this is a different kind of wave. It's a wave in space-time. It's not a wave where electric and magnetic fields are oscillating and traveling. And that there are certain conditions, again, which cannot happen in our labs, but will happen in the universe, where such waves will be produced. And these waves, like the electromagnetic spectrum, can have a whole range of frequencies, from very low frequencies to very high frequencies. And the LIGO detectors are designed to catch such waves passing past the Earth of a certain frequency range, whose periods are of the order of milliseconds. And as you would have all heard, the first such detections have happened in the last year or so. And there is now plan to have LIGO detectors, including one in India in the near future. Now, the connection with radio observations is, if I understand the question correctly, is that there are certain other much lower frequency gravitational waves which, when passing, so when the gravitational wave happens in an object, it's like a ripple that goes through the entire galaxy or the entire, nearby galaxies or whatever space of the universe it happens to. When that goes past certain stars, the neutron stars in our galaxy, it will disturb this periodic pulse signal that I was talking about that comes from neutron stars. And if you have very careful observations of the pulses, then you can actually infer that a gravitational wave passed by the neutron star or in the space intervening us in the neutron star and distorted that space-time and caused a change in the arrival of these regular ticks or pulses. And so that is where radio observations can do that. There is a third thing in certain neutron stars which are binaries with another star going around it. Gravitational wave can be produced due to the interaction of two neutron stars which are spiraling and beginning to coalesce, which is what produces a gravitational burst later on. And that change in the gravitational orbit of the neutron star can again be picked up by timing these pulses that come. Okay. So you can actually, so that this was one Nobel Prize that was given. So this was the first indirect evidence that gravitational waves exist, because they showed that the loss of energy of the binary neutron star system and the change in the orbit was exactly consistent with the predictions of Einstein's theory.
When was this?
This date observations were from 1970 up to 1990, and the Nobel Prize was 93 or so to Hulse and Taylor, for the two radio astronomers who first found this particular binary pulsar, just two neutron stars going around each other, realized the importance that if you time these pulses, and this experiment was done over 20 years, tuck, 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 you're measuring the same thing over 20 years, and then showing that the slow change in that can only be explained by the theory of relativity, and therefore that this system is emitting gravitational waves, losing energy via gravitational waves. So the gravitational waves have many ramifications in terms of their detectability.
So one inquisitorial question from SMS. What has been JMRT's biggest discovery so far?
That's a difficult question to answer because I'll end up being biased. But it is hard because it really depends on what you're talking about. So for example, the area that I work in neutron stars, pulsars, there have been interesting discoveries, finding new pulsars with the GMRT. In the space of understanding radio galaxies, there have been interesting discoveries where some very large and interesting radio galaxies at very far away in the early universe have been detected. There have been other discoveries about clusters of galaxies. Then there have been there have been studies of gamma ray bursts follow-up. So they're quite, there's a range of results in different areas. So it's hard to pick one.
Good. Okay, fair enough. Maybe we'll end with just one question to you. So again, from one of these. You mentioned protein structures. You talked about membrane proteins, structural protein, fibrous proteins. But why just proteins? Are there other big macromolecules that can also be studied whose structure is also equally
the other big
puzzling?
macromolecule is nucleic acids, for which you know the DNA structure. And of course, at that time people thought DNA structure was sort of fixed and frozen, but many, including a group from Madras University crystallography and biophysics led by one Dr. Gautam, has shown that DNA is quite flexible and a lot of varieties can be seen, and now nucleic acid also people have shown there are RNA variety of flexible things. But proteins, people are interested because protein are sort of like the workers of the cell, no? And they do everything, and through them you can control a lot, do a lot of work and things. And carbohydrates again is something that long sugar molecules. Again, surprisingly, Ramachandran and his group worked on carbohydrates. They did publish on carbohydrates and did some seminal work. But carbohydrate field as such is not so much in the open. It's a lot of industries, food industry especially does a lot of work on looking at structures of carbohydrates.
Are their structures well understood? Are there open questions?
Carbohydrate structures, there are not many which are available. There are a small number, and also the major amount, as I said, the 1,20,000 structures, the majority are only proteins. And carbohydrate, for example, in the lab of Ramachandran who started, there was one person, Ishwaran, who subsequently there is only one other person in the entire country who was working on carbohydrate structures, and that person was MS University, Tirunelveli, and he is retired. So you see, the carbohydrate structures is not much in demand because people don't see, but then carbohydrates attached to proteins are very important because they act as signaling molecules. When your sugar or glucose attaches to this, for example, your insulin, right? The hemoglobin, the sugar attaches to the hemoglobin, it becomes glucosylated hemoglobin, and that is a marker for saying whether your insulin is not working properly, because if the insulin doesn't bind to the receptor and clear the sugars away, then the sugar stays in the blood and gets attached to the hemoglobin. So people have studied glucosylated hemoglobin structures. So like that, proteins on which sugar molecules are festooned or decorated, those have been studied.
Thank you so much. Let's thank all our speakers once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.